Bonjour everyone, it is yours truly, Roger Mensakuli, founder of Black Rose Audio, and welcome to part 3 of how a speaker driver works. In this part, we're going to be talking about the unseen principles, magnetism and electromagnetism, that operate inside a speaker driver's motor structure. This is a subject that will have us dipping our toes into the topic of cosmic mechanics, i.e. nature. So I thought it would be rather apropos to record this video at my favorite place out in nature on this beautiful day. What's good? Okay, so just as a quick recap as to what the speaker driver's motor structure is and how it works, the motor structure is made up of the permanent magnet or field coil, if we're talking about a field coil dynamic driver, and the voice coil. The voice coil sets up the condition by which alternating current, electrical signals, are picked up by the terminals, which are either ends of the voice coil ultimately, from the amplifier and are converted or terminated as magnetism around the wires during signal transmission. And the magnetism that arises as a result of electricity terminating in the voice coil repels and attracts, superficially so, as I will explain what is actually happening later, against the standing magnetic field of the permanent magnet or field coil. As a result of the nature of the current being fed to the speaker being alternating, there's an alternating relationship that goes from repulsion to attraction and vice versa, repetitively between the temporary magnetic field of the voice coil and the permanent magnetic field of the permanent magnet / field coil. This alternating relationship of field states is the reason for the up and down movements that are then translated into sound. I can go right into talking about magnetism and electromagnetism, but I really need to build up to it and attack some points of contention first for it all to make sense. First major point, or what I would like to point out as the elephant in the room, is the predominant model of science that we have been taught by in academia and still hails over the science community, which comes with a mindset of its own, a materialistic mindset, and seeing everything as separate. Before I go deep into this subject, I want to preface that which I will be going into with this Nicola Tesla quote.
The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in 1 decade than in all the previous centuries of its existence.
There is no better quote to preface this conversation with than that one, because it intimates and stresses the importance of studying non-physical phenomena in our ability to truly being able to comprehend the nature of our reality. Having a lucid comprehension of non-physical phenomena, which are fields, and is really the only thing the term non-physical phenomena is referring to, is imperative to understand magnetism and electromagnetism and their attributes. The lack of true comprehension of fields and the non-physical when it pertains to scientific subjects is one of the greatest failings of the scientific community. The most we have done when it pertains to the subject of fields to show some sort of grasp of the subject is create equations like the 4 John Clerk Maxwell equations that measure a field's effect over a period of time. But that is not what a field is, but rather a measure of a field. Yet, when many scientists are asked what a field is, they will throw these equations at you as if they suffice as the explanation for what a field is at its root. This circles back to my whole issue with descriptions and observations being given as answers as to the essence of something. And while math is important to being able to replicate results and build things, math is merely just a measuring stick. It doesn't provide explanations to anything. It just provides calculations as to how to do something, not what something is at its root. Well, Roger, if our current scientific models are such a failure, then what is to be made out of the fact that new discoveries are continuously made that fuel innovation and allow us to build super advanced technology? I mean, we are in the modern age. We're at the height of sophistication, right? Well, my friend, descriptions are not explanations, and there is such a thing as correct observations but incorrect conclusions. And just because we are able to build advanced technology, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have an accurate comprehension of the elements that we are working with. Notice how the current predominant theories explaining the nature of our reality, such as relativity, quantum, and string theory, work themselves into a bind of contradictions. They may be correct with some things, but they are like that broken clock that is right twice a day. However, yet the new Toyota Corolla has been improved over the one the year before, and Apple makes a new iPhone every few years, so not a relevant argument at all. We can be working with elements and only have just enough of an understanding about them to use them to build things. Relativity, quantum, and string theory all have one thing in common, and that one thing is their materialistic undertones, or really what I should actually say is their atomistic undertones. Atomism is a mindset, and the denial of same, let me be clear, is not the denial of the demonstrable empirical evidence of atoms, but rather the denial of the mindset itself that sees atoms as the foundation for ultimate reality and every natural phenomenon being made up of little spherical particles, when really those spherical particles are just a state of the dynamic, ever-changing state of something else when the phenomena those so-called particles make up are in effect. This is why many of us can never get clear and straight answers from academia today and are turned off by the complication of same because of groupthink and the lens they look at reality through, which sets them up for failure, which sets us all up for failure when it comes into comprehension. There is so much I can rail on about the great failings of science today, more specifically in academia, and how it is holding us back. But I want to stay on subject and get back to magnetism and electromagnetism. Magnetism and electromagnetism are forces of nature, cards in the deck of cosmic mechanics that we have been able to understand the nuances of enough to be able to leverage technologically. With that said, to truly comprehend cosmic mechanics or to understand nature on her own grounds is to also understand that the non-physical governs over the physical, and that the physical or stable matter is just the highest form of intensity state of the non-physical. In other words, when it pertains to magnetism and electromagnetism, they are both a modality of one thing, analogous to what ice and steam are to water. That one thing is the medium by which all things in the cosmos are a modality of, and that one thing is the ether. I can go through the many proofs for the ether, but I would rather recommend you all to the man who awakened and helped me discover what I now know on this subject, Ken Wheeler, an absolute erudite and savant on the subject of field mechanics. With over 4,000 videos on the subject alone, he goes under the name Theoria Apophasis on YouTube, and he is the type of scientist defined under the Aristotelian context, which is the true definition of a scientist, that actually gives answers and goes into the root of things. I will have a link to a few of his videos that I really like and I think are good for those of you who are a little new to the topic but want to learn more. In fact, to establish a strong, deep-rooted understanding as to what I will be speaking on here, I would highly recommend that you all check out his YouTube channel because he beautifully unifies all things and clearly defines all that needs to be defined when it pertains to the subject. I'm not affiliated with him in any way, shape, or form, but I promise you his channel will change your life. Do not mind his personality. He is a great person, and the truth doesn't always come in the package that you like. Back to the subject of the ether. I want to make something known so it does not confuse us later down the road. The ether is not non-physical phenomena. It is just non-physical. The ether, like the old saying goes, radius is nowhere, but its circumference is everywhere, meaning that it is all around us. It permeates the entirety of the cosmos. It is the medium by which the entire cosmos sprouts from. It is the medium or substrate that, when perturbed, analogous to someone in a pond slapping the water, gives rise to all phenomena such as magnetism, electromagnetism, atoms, and all of the three-dimensional universe that we see before us, as well as the EMR spectrum. The ether is noumena, the substrate underneath all phenomena. Now, with the ether clearly defined, let's define what a field is. A field is simply an ether perturbation modality. Now, one may ask, how is something that is not a thing in the context of not being phenomenal, completely invisible, and is not palpable, able to create solid matter or this physical world that we see around us? That will be answered in one or many of the videos I have recommended done by Theoria Apophasis. Luckily, it is not important to be able to understand such a process to be able to follow this conversation on magnetism and electromagnetism. Now, let us move over to magnetism. Once we can wrap our minds around magnetism, we can then clearly comprehend electromagnetism, because electromagnetism is just a different way magnetism is made manifest. Magnetism, like Ken Wheeler defines it, I think is the best way one can define it, is simply the loss of energy or inertia of the dielectric. The dielectric being the ether under stress or strain. Let's unpack that. Loss of energy or inertia. Well, energy is analogous to the grenade in its stable state before it explodes. We think of energy as the explosion when the explosion is just the dissipation of energy. Now, with inertia, the word inertia has a second meaning outside of referring to an object in motion staying in motion, and that definition is the tendency to do nothing or to remain unchanged, as well as a property of matter by which it continues in its existing state of rest. The ether is inertial because it is in a state of rest before being perturbed. Energy is pure potential, which is at rest, like that grenade, in an unchanged inertial state. The ether is in a state of rest. It is inert, but when perturbed, power, which is another euphemism for energy dissipation, is made manifest. The magnetic field is analogous to the explosion of the grenade. When pure potential, i.e. the ether, is disturbed or perturbed in a particular fashion, it results in the energy dissipation, which is the loss of energy, that is the magnetic field. Magnetism doesn't just have to do with magnets, ferrous objects with a so-called North Pole and South Pole and what they do. It is nature's three-dimensional force vector. It is what gives an atom its spherical shape and eventually gives rise to this three-dimensional universe that atoms make up. It's funny, when talking about the magnetic field in relation to the permanent magnet of the speaker driver, I previously said that the magnetic field was emanating from that block of metal that is the magnet. I use emanating from for the sake of parlance. Although superficially correct, that is ultimately incorrect. The magnetic field that is ab extra or around the permanent magnet is occurring as a field depression in the ether, as a form of ether voidance. To better help you all visualize what I'm saying, just imagine, or you could try this sometime, where you pour cooking oil into a pan in a donut-like circular fashion, where you leave a single spot in the center uncovered by oil. That spot being the fulcrum by which you pour oil around, and the product of which, after pouring, is normally an awkward-looking donut-shaped puddle of oil in the pan. Next step would be to attempt to get the oil puddle to close in on itself so you can have one complete large puddle of oil with no holes in the pan. To do this, you want to swirl the pan around. Now, it won't be a perfect circular symmetrical movement, but imagine it was while the puddle closes in on itself to fill that circular gap in the center. That was the fulcrum. Well, that is essentially what is occurring with the magnetic field with respect to the ether all around, but the inverse movement because of the expansion of the magnetic field, more specifically during the creation of a permanent magnet. The ether in the analogy is the oil, and the closing gap, which should be an opening gap, is the magnetic field. When a magnet is created by capacitor banks dumping large amounts of electricity into that block of metal that later becomes an electrified object we call a magnet, it creates a three-dimensional toroidal field depression that occurs symmetrically around and away from the metal. It is analogous to the oil closing in on itself scenario, but the inverse movement in a toroidal three-dimensional field depression version of that in the case of our magnet and magnetic field scenario with respect to the ether all around, right? With this visualization and understanding, it is easy to see how all fields, including the magnetic field, are simply just the ether being perturbed in a particular fashion to react and bring about said field. To see the magnetic field as a separate entity, if you will, and not as a reaction of the medium, would be like that blind man who grabs the tail of an elephant and says it's a snake. You're missing the whole picture. Now that we know what magnetism is and its attributes, let us move over to electromagnetism as it pertains to the field coil of a field coil dynamic driver and the voice coil of all dynamic speaker drivers. Electromagnetism is simply magnetism being made manifest under different conditions. To better explain what I mean, let me show you these two pictures here side by side. On the left, we have a diagram taken out of page 11 of Charles Proteus Steinmetz's book, Electric Discharges, Waves, and Impulses, and on the right, we have an image made of iron filings. Can you tell me which image is the cross-section of alternating current AC lines being electrically induced looking at them head-on? And which one is the viewing of a permanent magnet and its magnetic field velocity and poles? The answer is that both suffice as the viewing of the permanent magnet and its field velocity, as well as the cross-section of AC lines being electrically induced. The AC lines are no different than an electromagnet, and moreover, the only difference between an electromagnet and a permanent magnet is where the areas of induction occur where magnetism creates its field depression from. Hence, magnetism being made manifest under different conditions. Let us bring up those two images again so we can go a little deeper on that point. Now I'm going to introduce a semi-new term that I used just briefly a little earlier, and that term is the dielectric. It is actually an old term ultimately. Do you see those two dots or circles in either picture that, in the case of the iron filing picture, the iron filings seem to be circling the two holes, and in the case of the diagram, the lines seem to be emanating from? Those two holes represent the dielectric, which is defined as the ether under stress or strain. Where those holes lie are areas where magnetism does not exist, but where the dielectric is dominant. And where the dielectric is dominant, there is a strong acceleration towards rest and the elimination of space. This is the inverse of magnetism, which again is the loss of energy or inertia of the dielectric, resulting in the creation of space or volume. And this is a really good time to say this. There's only space in fields. There are no fields in space, and space does not do anything. Space is simply just the after effect of a divergent magnetic field. Space is analogous to a shadow. A shadow is just the absence of light as a result of something blocking the light. I feel the need to say this because I feel that it is imperative to point out the false claims of the theory of relativity that says one can bend space or time, or how the theory talks about these two concepts as if they have the ability to act upon things and do things, i.e. concept reification, something that Nicola Tesla railed against. Sometimes when I hear people who subscribe to the theory of relativity say bending space-time, it sounds to me like they are talking about bending or perturbing the ether just in a different way. Just a food for thought. But back to talking about the dielectric. The dielectric is the ether's tendency to want to snap back to its inertial rest state when perturbed, like that rubber band when stretched. This tendency of the ether is the underlying factor behind an atomic element's rate of decay and half-life. Let me bring another image that intimates the accurate relationship between the dielectric and the magnetic. This is a picture of a magnet under a ferrocell. A ferrocell is made by squeezing a mineral oil and ferrofluid mixture between two optically flat glass in a structure, and either sunlight or LED bulbs can be used to show what the ferrocell is revealing about the magnetic field. This is much more precise than the iron filing system that we have all been accustomed to when looking at the magnetic field velocity. All the bright yellow lines that you see are magnetism, and all the dark spots are the dielectric. Magnetism bends the light being used to view the field geometry around itself, while dielectricity is absorbing the light. In fact, the diagram taken from page 11 of Electric Discharges, Waves, and Impulses, which was actually meant to show the cross-section of AC lines head-on when induced, if it prioritized showing field geometry over field pressure gradients, it would look like the ferrocell, but doubled side by side. Now that we have talked about the dielectric, let us pair that with the point about electromagnetism being simply magnetism made manifest under different conditions, with this having to do with field induction. I have a great analogy for this. Imagine holding a perfectly spherically shaped clay ball and then choking the clay ball at its equator. And at the same time that is happening, another person using their pointer fingers is pushing into the clay ball at north and south. This is representative of a permanent magnet. Now imagine a clay cylinder. Imagine the cylinder being choked like the equator of the clay ball, but at equally spaced intervals along the cylinder. And while that is happening, you have fingers pushing in at the circular faces north and south of the cylinder. This is representative of an electromagnet, and with the size and frequency of the flattened discs as a result of the cylinder being squeezed, being representative of the frequency at which the electromagnet is operating at. The hand and pointer fingers are representative of the dielectric. You see, during the creation of the permanent magnet, when large amounts of electricity are dumped from capacitor banks into the ferrous mass that later becomes a magnet, the electricity excites the ether in and around that ferrous mass into a state of coherency, which shows up as dielectric movements. The dielectric being the ether under stress or strain as a result of what? Excitation. This is analogous to the hand choking the clay ball at its equator and the two pointer fingers squeezing in at the poles at the same time. This would be a great time to break down what electricity is itself, which is also tied into why electricity has this effect of exciting the ether into a state of coherency. Well, from the same page that I borrowed that diagram from page 11 of Charles P Steinmetz's book, Electric Discharges, Waves, and Impulses, he intimates what electricity is by saying the magnetic and the dielectric field of the conductors both are included in the term electric field. By this, he means that electricity is a combination of the magnetic and dielectric, and this is spot on considering the effects electricity has and yields during the creation of a magnet. Simply what is happening in the creation of a magnet is that electricity being part dielectric excites the dielectric into a state of coherency with space erasing movements of the dielectric, i.e. areas of induction happening at the equator of the magnet known as the plane of inertia and the poles. This would be the large dot seen in the center of the ferrocell picture, as well as the two large dots seen in the diagram and iron filing pictures as well. The result of the clay ball being squeezed in the three places is similar to the magnetic field that comes as a result of the completion of the creation of a magnet. Electromagnetism would simply be the same thing but with multiple choke points. The phenomena of electromagnetism would have magnetism reciprocating around the wires. This is what I meant when I said electricity terminates as magnetism in the first video of the series. The phenomena around a conducting wire of an electromagnet, although unseen, would manifest itself as multiple flattened toroidal disk field depressions, with their axes lined along the wire like beads on a necklace, similar to the end result of the clay ball being squeezed the way we talked about. Induction along the z-axis, or the fingers pushing in at the poles of the clay ball, is the similarity between an electromagnet and a permanent magnet that I was trying to highlight by bringing up the graphed and iron filing images. In the case of an electromagnet, what would take place for the two large dots, the dielectric, would be the wires that have a very low magnetic permeability, i.e. a conductor, which means they're low on being able to be influenced by a magnetic field. This is why they reflect magnetism. In conclusion, this is the microscopic view of a permanent magnet and an electromagnet as it pertains to the permanent magnet of the dynamic speaker driver and the electromagnetic components, the field coil and voice coil. I'm still not done sharing all that I need to share when it comes to the field mechanics of how a speaker driver works, but I do know that I have shared a lot. So to not overwhelm you all, I'm going to section off what is left off on this topic regarding the subject into my final video in the series, video 4, where I talk about how all that we have learned about field mechanics in this video work together to make a speaker driver work the way it works. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in on part 3 of how a speaker driver works. It's obviously dark, but that's what comes with the territory of recording in nature. I love you guys so much, and we'll see you guys soon. Peace.